Goose Switch Hat today, and first I'm cutting out the pattern. So for the lined goose hat, you need to cut out one of the hat top and one of the hat brim with both the lining and the regular fabric, like the exterior fabric. So I like to actually lay mine with wrong sides or right sides together and cut them out at the same time. I use pins to pin the pattern down so there's no shifting, but I do like to use a rotary cutter on projects like this because I can get a little bit cleaner, smoother cut, and I don't have to worry about anything with the scissors and lifting the pattern up to cut it out. If you're not comfortable with a rotary cutter like this, definitely use your scissors to cut out, which I'm going to demonstrate right here when I get to the hat brim. And you can see potentially up at the top of the screen there above where I'm cutting that I have the two printed pattern pieces to cut out. So yes, I just use scissors here on the hat brim, and it's just a circle. The trick with cutting out pattern pieces is to butt your scissors up right next to the pattern without cutting the pattern, and trying to get your pattern piece to be as precise as possible to the pattern, because that pattern is fitted properly to the other pieces, so everything works out well. If you cut it out a little bit too big or a little bit too small, your seam allowances and the sewing together of the hat and the brim aren't going to work as well, because you are insetting the hat into this inner circle. So to cut this inner circle out, I just fold it in half to cut a slit so I can get my scissors in there, and then I'm just using my scissors to go around the inside of that circle, just being careful to stay as close to the pattern as possible, whether you have to lay your pattern flat for that or hold it up. Just be careful that there's no gaping between the pattern and the fabric, so you get a nice clean cut. Once you have everything cut out, you're ready to sew up your lined Silly Goose Witch hat. You also do need to cut like a 6.5 inch long piece of elastic or some ties out of ribbon or cording. If you are interested in the quilted version, skip to the second half of the video for that option. But we're going to head over to the sewing machine to get sewing. So we have two of each cut out, two of our hat top and two of our hat brim. So, and then also if you want to do elastic, it's about 6.5 inches, goes around the goose chin just fine. Or you can have two ties, roughly 10 inches long each, that you can attach in, and I will show you where to attach this. You don't have to use elastic or ties, you could just place it on the head, but it helps keep it on, of course. First, we are going to sew our hat top together down this straight edge by aligning the straight edge, and we're just going to do a 1/4 inch seam. We're going to do that for both the exterior fabric and the lining, but for the lining we want to leave an opening to turn the hat by, about this wide, 1.5 inches to 2 inches. This hat would be reversible if you do not use ties. If you use ties, it does become unreversible because then the ties are on the top of the brim if you turn it inside out. But if you could always tie it in a bow or something too. So first we're going to do that. So here we have our two pieces. You can see this has the opening, no opening. Now with our two hat tops, we want to create creases. I'm just going to do this with a seam press, like for FPP, but use your iron. I just don't want to swivel the camera. And press a crease directly across from the seam, and then you're going to fold it again and opposite, aligning that crease with the seam, and then press a crease where it flattens out on each side. So you want to have 4 creases in each of the hat tops to give us kind of registration marks for when we sew together around the brim. This will allow us to align everything evenly. So I'm going to do that again on the exterior of the hat. And I'm going to repeat those steps on the brim by folding it in half, and we want it on the inner circle. We don't really need it on the outer circle, just a little press, and then aligning those 2 creases together, and then press the other 2 sides where they end up folding out to, and repeat with the second hat brim. So now if you are using ties or elastic, we do want to attach those to the lining, and we're going to just align it with the side creases. So this would be the back crease where the seam is and the front crease, and then we have the 2 side creases. And we want to align this on the right side, just right where that crease is. And then I just like to tack it down just close to the seam line so that when we actually sew our 1/4 inch seam, that little tack mark is inside the seam. So maybe 1/8 of an inch away. Then we're going to extend this elastic over to this side, being careful not to twist it, and do the same thing with it aligned on the side crease on the other side. If you're using ties, you're going to do the same thing with the end of the tie on one side, and then the second tie, one of the ends on the other side, and then they'll just be open in the middle. The other thing that we should do now, and I've done it on the hat exterior, is trim that point a little. You can see how it sticks up on the lining still and is trimmed. So what I do is just a little bit away from the seam line, trim it down, and that allows us to have very little fabric in the point once we turn it right sides out, because those seams are going to end up bumping up next to each other once the 2 pieces are connected. Okay, now that we have our ties on our lining and we can attach the brim of our lining, you probably should use pins for this. This is where the registration marks come in that we made creases. So we want to turn our hat, this is the lining, right side out. And we want to keep the ties or the elastic going up towards the hat. And then we want to put our hat point first in through the little hole, and we're going to start to align those creases on the brim and the hat, and we're just going to put a pin, and I like to put the pin in this direction and pin all around the hat, matching just where the creases are. I don't pin, I guess, the other part because I want to just kind of use that area to ease around the curve. If you've ever sewn curves, you will 100% understand this, I believe. If you have not sewn curves, just be patient and watch me do it first and then try. If you're unsure, use a larger stitch to baste it and test that out, and then you can always go back and do a shorter regular stitch once you're confident and you have it in the right spot. Okay, so I'm going to do the same with this one, and then we'll sew them all together. We have our outside sewn together, so we're going to do the same thing for our lining. And the reason you may not see part of the hat being sewn is because I have to take pictures as well for the pattern. So I like to start at the back seam just because then it's tacked down and I don't have to worry. And I like to have the hat, like the bottom piece of fabric and the brim on top. That's because there's going to be areas where we have to ease the brim to fit the edge of the hat, and it's easier this way. I've sewn it both ways, and to me, it's easier this way. If you are used to curves and like to do it the other way better, please do, because whatever makes sewing curves easier and enjoyable, in my opinion. They're not super my favorite, but definitely necessary. Be careful as you're going over the elastic. Don't let that surprise you. You could always do an extra back stitch there if you would like. Continue sewing around, easing the fabric to meet the edge, because remember, the curve of our brim that we're sewing to the curve of the hat are opposite, so they're going to need to have a little bit of give and movement to fit well. If you have a pucker or two, don't let that scare you. You can always go back and kind of pick it out with a seam ripper and kind of ease the fabric in that area if you want. But I did try to write the pattern so that it fits well, as long as you are cutting accurately the pattern and the fabric itself. Fingers crossed for you, it works out. I made several versions of this where I just increase the size of the circle or decrease the size of the circle minute amounts, and to finally get it what I think is right. So there we have our lining, and it looks like I have a few wrinkles. It's just because the fabric is kind of creased. There might be a few in there, but overall it worked out pretty well. We have our elastic to hold it under the goose's head, and we have our opening to turn it with. So now what we're going to do is we're going to sew the outer brim together, and that is pretty simple. You can, whichever hat you like, turn it inside out, so it's like the opposite, and we're just going to place that directly on top and align the rims. And what I like to do is make sure the seam here and the seam on the other one is aligned relatively in the same spot, and then you can attach your brim together and just sew around the circle. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end to lock those seams in place. This should go pretty easily, and you don't have to leave an opening here because we have the opening in the top part of the hat top, so it's hidden. And we're just going to follow that around. 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. It's okay if it's a little bit less or more in places. The goal is just to keep that seam line smooth and keep everything aligned so that when we get back to the start of our seam, we don't have any bubbles in the fabric. Make sure if you have elastic or ties that you feel just a little bit, like I can feel the edge of the elastic here, but it's not anywhere close to my seam. We don't want to catch any of those in the brim. And I do like to backstitch. So there we have, everything's inside out, and we're going to turn it right side out. You can clip these seams if you want. Not super necessary because the fabric is going to turn in. If the curve was the opposite of this, we would want to clip them. I do kind of recommend clipping a few places around the brim here, just so that it has a little bit of ease and isn't like super taut. So you'll do that on both sides if you want. You can always come back and do it if it feels like there's no give on the hat after you've turned it. Okay, so we are just going to pull the fabric out there, and we're going to pull the hat through that hole in the lining of the hat like this, so it's all right side out. And then we want the hat to be on the right side. So we're going to push the lining into the hat top, and then you're just going to kind of smooth all of these edges out and press it with an iron. The couple things that you could do to finish it off are, if you want to attach the two pieces together so they don't move, once you get everything ironed, you could do a top stitch along the edge here to connect the lining to the hat top. You could also do a top stitch around the outer edge, but I don't find that necessary after it's ironed. The only thing you really do want to do is sew up this seam, either with just the sewing machine if you're not making a reversible hat, and stitch across it after it's flattened out, or you can whip stitch it closed if you're making a reversible hat. Okay, to press this, you just want to kind of smooth out those edges as you iron around, and that will really give it a more finished look once those edges are pressed together. And then, like I said, we can close up the opening. I'm just going to do it on my sewing machine since I'm not making this reversible. So on the sewing machine, I just kind of flatten that seam by kind of pulling on each side and tucking it together. And then I just do a very close to the edge top stitch. If you are making a reversible hat, I definitely recommend, I think I said whip stitch earlier, but I recommend a ladder stitch, and I'll have a video on my YouTube for the ladder stitch, how to make that so it's an invisible seam closure. But this is our witch hat. Like I said, if you really wanted to, you could do a top stitch, like basically along this seam here, just to hold them together, but I haven't found really that that's necessary. We can go pop it on a goose and just see what it looks like. Okay, we've got our goose friend one hat on, and then we're going to add the hat to this lovely lady. Now, I don't use any interfacing. I guess that's something else you could do if you want it to be a little bit stiffer, is add some interfacing. I don't really think you would need more than like an SF101. How do they look? Pretty good. But I really don't see the need for it. And I think that it just makes it a much simpler, quick project if you do leave the SF101 off. There we go. We are going to make a quilted hat now. And the main difference with this is that it is the lining and main fabric are quilted in a panel, and then you cut out the pieces. You sew it together the exact same with the seam, and the seam, which you could zigzag edge or bind. I didn't really see the need. And then we just bind the edge. So how I would do this is I would personally just lay my fabrics together and cut a piece out that's big enough for both of them. And the pattern, I believe, says a fat eighth, and that is completely fine. Will it fit this way? Yeah. But also, if you just are using fabric you have on hand, definitely go that route. Scrap fabric is great. So I'm just grabbing then, so I have my two fabrics, and I am going to place them one fabric up, right side up, I guess, with my batting, and just cutting out my batting to be about the same size. And then I'm going to place my lining fabric on top. I would probably end up quilting on the outside piece, but because my lining piece is a little bit different size, that's where I'm going to cut it out after it's quilted. So I'll go and quilt this piece of fabric just really loosely, I think. I did this one very densely, but I'll probably just do this really quick just for demonstration purposes, and then we'll come back to cut this out. Okay, so we have our quilted panel here. This is also a great project to do on the long arm, or if you're quilting panels for bags or have a quilt you're doing, quilt a little bit extra, because as you can see, this uses such a small amount of fabric. So what we're going to do is just lay our pieces down just like before. If you're working with smaller amounts of fabric like this, just double check that everything is going to line up. With a fat eighth, you will be 100% fine. As you can see in this video for both, I do tend to use my rotary cutter for cutting. This takes a little bit of practice, but I find with larger, simple cuts like this, especially curves with pattern pieces, it's so much easier to use a rotary cutter because the pattern stays flush with the fabric. Then when you're pinning fabric, sometimes it can pop up if you're lifting things. I didn't do this on the last one, but I will even do this for curves. The only thing I won't do this for is the inner curve. Okay, so for that inner curve, I should probably grab some pins. Okay, just because we want it to stay in place, and it's actually probably better if you can pin it closer to the curve here so we don't have any gaping. I'm just cutting a slit in the middle and then cut out to a side and ease your scissors around. Just being careful not to let the pattern kind of gape away from the fabric. And what I mean by that is if the pattern gapes or pulls away from the fabric, it can like skew where you're going to cut. So we have both of our pieces. Okay, our last thing we need is the bias binding. So I have you do this with a 10-inch square, but you could definitely just cut a piece of binding on the bias if you're using fabric from home. And I would do that by 100% sure to get the right size measuring around, but I believe it's around 22 inches. So if you have a 10-inch square, this is what I do for bias binding. I am actually going to cut at an angle, and then I'm going to sew these together like this. So I sewed those two together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I have kind of like a parallelogram, is that what it's called? So I want to cut 2 strips out of this that are 2 1/4 inches wide, and you'll have some leftover from this. These are our 2 strips that we will have for binding, and you have a little bit left over. If you wanted to bind the insides, you could do it with that. Definitely bias binding is great. You're going to actually go to your machine and then sew these into one long piece. But we're going to go to the machine and work on sewing everything up. Okay, here we are at the machine, and I'm just going to sew together these bias strips to make a long bias strip binding. Again, just using a roughly 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because you started with a square, if you started with a square, I guess, it should have been on a bias already. A bias just means that it has stretch. So see how it stretches nicely. This is the grain. So if I pull like with the grain, there's no stretch, like nothing gives. But if I pull against the grain, we've got a nice stretch to go around those curves. So we have our longer bias piece. press that seam flat or open. And first we're going to bind our brim. So my recommendation is to attach the binding on the top or exterior of the hat and then fold it around to the bottom and top stitch it in the ditch of the top. So you can do that with blending thread, so it just blends right away. I'm doing it with white thread so we can see it better, and because of the way I quilted this, it just kind of gives a nice extra detail. To do that, just start with a little bit of a tail so you can attach at the end. If you measure around your hat, you could actually cut your piece to that size and then sew the ends together so you have a ring of binding and sew it on. It's kind of like next level, but just as you're going, kind of give it a little stretch so it goes around the curve and gives us a nice, we don't want to like pull it, but we want to have it be nice and smooth around that curved edge so that it gives us a nice clean binding once we pull it to the other side. Okay, I do apologize if the viewpoint changes randomly just because of the having to stop to take pictures here and there. It may alter the viewpoint a little bit, so if that freaks you out, try not to let it, or that's the reason why, I guess. Okay, so once we get back towards the beginning, it actually looks like I can take off this little tail. I forgot that happened to me last time. So I'm actually going to stop it, do a little back stitch, and then because I want to attach these ends, so it looks like I can take off this little bit here. Can't find my other seam ripper, so luckily I didn't use a very strong stitch. So how I do that, it's on the bias. It looks like I can even take off this little tail, which is kind of awesome. So maybe you don't have to actually cut the purpose of cutting and sewing the binding fabric like I did is so you get longer stretches without a seam, but I don't know that you actually need to do that. Okay, so this is just a little bit of smoothing because it's on a curve. You've got some of that happening, so you just kind of got to eyeball it and attach it in place. It's not like there's no like real method to this madness, but I just kind of line it up the best I can. You can always reduce that if you need. Just make sure you're attaching it on the bias so that once it's attached, you don't have any extra bubbles or anything. And then, yeah, trim off that. If you can, press that seam open, even finger pressing is great, and then finish attaching the binding. Okay, so there's our kind of donut with the binding attached, and you can see it's pretty smooth. So what we're going to do next is we're going to fold that binding over all the way around. And then onto the back side. We're going to kind of tuck it under and smooth it out. We want it to extend, that folded edge to extend past the seam that you can see kind of under there, because that's the seam that's going to help us guide for a top stitch on the other side. And we want it to catch on this side. So once you have it kind of all folded under, you can definitely use the iron to help you press this in place. Okay, so we have everything turned under, but sometimes it doesn't hold. So if you really need to pin it on the underside, I have a couple pins here, but you just want to keep an eye on them. And then on the top side, we want to keep that stitch in the ditch as close to the brim as possible. You could do it on the brim. If you are doing like a solid fabric on the brim, you can match the thread perfectly. And we want to make sure we keep it so that we're catching our fabric in the seam. So kind of to do that, we're going to have to potentially pin here on this one. I don't know if it's the fabric for me or what. The last one I didn't have to do that on, but this one seems to want me to. Okay, so I did pin it all the way around because I just think that it'll hold better. So just starting, if you don't want to have a big back stitch, you could do a lock stitch if you have that feature on your machine. I'm just trying to keep my stitch right along the edge. You could do it on the brim or off the brim. On the brim may allow to see a little bit of your stitches underneath at some point. But if you want it to really blend well, maybe you pick a solid color brim and then the thread can blend in perfectly with that. So there you have it. Oops, sorry. It goes from being a little bit like, feels like it's going to bubble up to being pretty flat. And now we're just going to sew this exactly the same way we sewed the other one, just with one layer, by making those crease marks. I like to put this little mark from the binding at the back if there's one that's noticeable, like this one is less noticeable. If it's too thick to make a crease mark with the iron, fold it and use pins to hold that center mark, and then align the pins to make the next center marks. And then we're going to take our hat top and put right sides together or outsides together, and you can stitch this all the way up because it's not lined. Do the same thing where you clip that end, and then we're gonna make our registration marks here with the pins as well. So we want one on the opposite side of the seam, and then connect that and do pins on either side. So then we're going to sew this together. Actually, you might want to turn this inside out before, or right sides out, before you put those pins in. We want the outside to face out first. Okay, so I did turn it right side out, and we have the pins and the seam. So we want to take the hat and have the bottom or the lining side facing out, and we put the hat in cone first or point first so that the short side, so when we sew those together, both the right sides will be on the outside. So aligning the seams and the pins, or the pin with the pin, is you're going to do the exact same thing you did before. And then you're going to sew it together. The only difference on this, if you decide not to bind the inside seam here, like this one is not bound, I did try and push the seam towards the hat and do a top stitch along so it kind of holds it up. Because once it's on the goose, you don't really see that. But you could definitely bind the seam as well, or zigzag it so it just has a more finished look to it. Again, it is best if you have the hat side down and the brim side up. It is a little bit trickier that way, but I think everything aligns better that way. Don't forget your back stitch and just kind of follow the curve around your hat. You can kind of see just every so often I'm stopping to realign stuff, make sure everything looks nice and smooth, and we'll sew together nicely. There we go. And you have that. So you could definitely bind that with your extra binding pieces. You could iron your binding piece so it's kind of like a double fold binding and just kind of insert that over and sew it on. Or you could do it the same way we did it by sewing it on and then looping it over and sewing it on. I don't actually mind just it like that. I tend to not make the quilted version as much. So I'm just going to actually go like this to top stitch that down, and that will suffice for me. Just gives it a little extra bit of structure there. There we go.